Welcome to Time as Constraint on Decision Making, Chapter 6 of Economics, Time, Mind, and Spirit. So when we looked at time as a resource, it was like a quantity in a moment. When we looked at time as a distance, it was like the length of a path. Time as a constraint on decision making is like having the space to decide. So, how quickly must a decision be made? Time becomes a constraint on decision-making when what is feasible changes over time, such as the good old phrase, going, gone. Right? This can be an immediate change, such as bidding before a deadline and then not being able to bid afterwards. There can be a more gradual change, such as running out of various colors of a shirt or flavors of an ice cream by taking too long to decide. The more quickly a decision must be made, the greater the impact on how we make the decision. If you are the only other person in the room and you are a stranger to this child who's about to grab a very, very hot skillet, how do you respond? The more time you have to make a decision, the farther into the future consequences can become relevant. Does a salesperson give you information and suggest you think about it for a couple of weeks? Or do they assert you need to make a decision now before someone else buys what you want? Daniel Kahneman in 2011 presented the idea of thinking fast and slow. Stanovich and West presented the notion of two systems. So system one operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. And system two allocates attention to the effortful mental activities that demand it, including complex computations. So the operations of system two are often associated with the subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration. Now we can make a corporate analogy. So the CEO makes important long-term strategic decisions depending on summaries from subordinates to know what is going on. The actual behavior, could be production or sales, maintenance, so forth, is done by lower level employees who are the ones that choose in the moment what to do. Well, this raises another question. Is more better than less for time constraints? So expected utility of decisions made quickly versus the expected utility of a decision made slowly. Do you get hedons, in other words, hedonic pleasure, from a fast choice? Do you get it from a slow choice? The implication being savoring the decision-making process and anxiety from uncertainty when making decisions can impact overall experience of making a decision. So it's not just about the benefit from making a quote-unquote better decision, but how much agony or enjoyment do you have in the process of making a decision? What happens when two systems won't do? We're going to consider the difference between the reflexive or the non-reflexive, which we can describe as an immediate decision or choice, or a mediated one. Then there is the reflective or non-reflective. In other words, is it reason-based, intellectual thought through, or is it emotions and emotionally based? And then there's recursive or non-recursive. So that's the realm of the transcendent or the mundane decision-making. So when we're talking about recursive decision-making, it's essentially making decisions about how you're making decisions. We will refer to physical decision-making when we're dealing with an immediate decision. In other words, these are reflexive. They're instinctive responses. So this is a situation where there is no time to reflect or even express what your preferences are. It's whatever you are hardwired to do you do. This is sort of the traditional stimulus reaction. And we can talk about what we might say as the natural flow. In other words, if you are talking about how a physical body is going to respond to a stimulus, and it's something that needs to be done within a second or something like that, it's got to be hardwired, and it's whatever the natural structure of that decision maker, could be your body, could be a computer, is set up. So that's a natural flow. In contrast is emotional decision making. So the emotional refers to a mediated decision. So this is not a reflex, right? Physical decision making is about reflexes. You get tapped on your knee, you get a reflexive response. So these are mediated decisions such that one does not reflect on the alternatives or the considered consequences. So it's as if your feelings and desires in that moment are the sole driver of the decision and choice you make. And visually, how do we see this? Well, there's the stimulus. Based on the stimulus, the body has a natural flow of how it would want to react. But since there's enough time, that stimulus also can trigger feelings and emotions. And out of the feelings and emotions, there will be an emotive force. And that emotive force will mediate the natural flow. And so now you have a mediated flow of willpower that leads to a choice. Whereas physical decision making is sort of a stimulus and a reaction, the emotional is closer to there's a stimulus and you make a choice. Now, what about rational decision making? Well, the rational refers to mediated decisions where one does reflect on the consequences. However, it's a finite reflection. Right? So you may be conscious of your feelings and desires of that moment, but temper them with consideration for the future consequences of your actions. And so visually, we can see it as follows. There's a stimulus, and it starts off with the natural flow, and also whatever emotive force is being generated. And it goes through a series of triggering the part of your mind that thinks and reasons, and you go back and forth a few times. You imagine, okay, well, what would happen if this occurs, and what was the consequence of that? And when you have this reflection, there'll typically be multiple reflections. And if you have enough time, you end up with a decision that's been reasoned. So this is a different structure than relative to emotional decision making, where, yes, it is now mediating the natural instinctive flow, but there is no reflection with emotions. In the rational world, there is reflection. So what about spiritual or transcendent decision making? Well, this can be used to describe decisions that seem to transcend who you are being as a decision maker, as if it's made from an eternal perspective. So these decisions tend to be recursive in nature, as if an infinite reflection. So what's going on? We're going from the physical decision making, where it is no mediation on how your body is going to react, to emotional, where there is a mediation, but there's no reflection, to the realm of the rational, where now there is some reflection, but it's not infinite. You got a sort of finite amount of time to respond. To the realm of transcendent or recursive decision making, where probably making decisions about how to make decisions. From a mathematical standpoint, you're dealing with a recursive function, and so you kind of have to step back even a little bit further to get the intuitions that you need. So these will affect having preferences over your preferences. What is it that you want to want, as the phrase can be used? And these are the types of things that affect your rationality. So this is the realm of transcendence and intuitions. And This is the notion of a infinite reflection, right? So even how you're choosing to reflect on your reflections, that's part of the choice and decisions that you're making. And there's a very deep role of recursion in self-consciousness and identity. So one book, or a couple books actually, which would be of interest, is Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach, and his second book, I Am a Strange Loop. And from the realm of religion and spiritual statements about the divine, you have the phrase, I am what I am. Thou art that thou art. And another way to picture this is to consider Zeno's paradox. So this is from the time of the ancient Greeks. And the idea is this: if each step takes you half the way remaining to your goal, you could take an infinity of steps and never get there. Well, from that first kind of reasoning, you might go, oh my goodness, yeah, well, so going halfway of remaining to your goal, that's progress, but you'll never get there. Well, how do you solve Zeno's paradox? Well, the solution is there is not a single point, and you can get close enough in finite steps to satisfactorily stop and move on to the next task. The key idea here is the duration of each step also gets smaller. As the steps get smaller, then the amount of time associated with making those steps also gets smaller. So a seeming infinity of steps actually can be approximated by a finite number of steps, and that finite number of steps can be associated with a finite period of time. Essentially, you get close enough to say that you get there. But notice there's a recursive element here. You have to step back and not only look at the problem, but understand what is involved. Now, this relates to standard economic categories in decision making. Okay, one is market period. So this is where all of production is fixed. The only decision is to sell or not sell. So when we talk about the market period, an example of this would be something like a farmer's market, where the vendor comes in with the amount of product that they have, and it could be vegetables and fruit or pies or breads or whatever it is they're selling, but they come with that inventory for the day. There is not enough time to go produce or make any more. So in a market period, the amount that's been produced is fixed. It's just a decision of what price do you sell it at, and you end up selling all of it or not. The short run is one where some, but not of all production is variable. In other words, some of the inputs in the production process can be variable. Classic way that we think about this in economics is short run would be a situation where maybe you could hire some part-time workers or get some more raw materials or ingredients, but you can't build a new manufacturing plant. You can't build a new bakery in that short period of time. So some of the infrastructure, the plant, some of the physical capital, that's fixed. So you have some control over how much you can produce, but you don't have a complete control. So you have a few decisions to make on how and how much to produce. Now, economists also talk about the long run. And in this situation, all of production is variable. That means all the inputs to what you're going to produce is variable in the sense of how much you choose. So if it's, if you're talking about a 5-year time horizon, now you can be talking about, okay, do we build another plant, add on a new team? Things like that, which in the short run you don't consider because you just don't have enough time to implement them. But in the long run, you would have enough time to do this. But in economics, we make the assumption that in the long run, technology is fixed. In other words, the relationship between how much of the different inputs you put in and how much you produce in output, that relationship is fixed. In the long run, yes, you can expand plant size, but you're still dealing with the same technology. So in the long run, you have even more decisions to make. As we see, as we're going along these economic categories, we're going from not much in the way of decisions to make, do you sell or not sell, to, okay, maybe you can increase some inputs, to, well, now we could change all the inputs. And then economists will talk about the very long run. And this is the realm where even technology is not fixed. In this case, decision making is more visionary and creative. This is the realm where you could start imagining different technology, developing new technology. And that is different than the long run where technology is fixed and you're just trying to optimize given what is feasible. In the very long run, you're changing what is feasible. And if we put this into a table, we see the 4 different runs on the left: immediate or market period, short run, long run, very long run. And then across the top, there's the quantity produced, what's going on with the inputs, what about the production function, is it fixed or variable, and what kind of decision making. So in the immediate run, profit maximization collapses to revenue maximization. But because you can't change any of the inputs, then how much you're paying for the inputs is fixed. So if the cost of the production is fixed, then how you maximize your profits is to maximize your revenue, since profit is equal to revenue minus cost. If cost is fixed, then maximizing revenue is profit maximization. In the short run, it's about loss minimization. Now, in the short run, you could still make a profit, but it's still driven more by loss minimization than profit maximization, because in the short run, you have all these fixed costs and you have some variable costs. And the question comes down to, if you're going to produce, can you at least cover the variable costs? And if you can cover your variable costs, then it's worthwhile, because now you're reducing the loss from your fixed costs. In the long run, because all the inputs are variable, there are only variable costs. So total costs are variable costs, and this is fully profit maximization. The implication being that in the long run, you never have to make a decision where you're going to experience a loss, because you could just get out of the business altogether. And then the very long run, quantity produced is variable, all the inputs are variable, and even the production function is variable. And here, changing technology is part of costs. And that's why it's different than the short run and the long run. Because now your ability to produce given resources can be changed by how you invest in technology and innovation. So summarizing time and choice, you have the immediate and reflexive, so that's the physical and your senses. You have the mediate and non-reflective, so that's the realm of the emotional and feelings. You have the mediate reflective, so the realm of rational and thoughts. And then you have the eternal or recursive, the realm of spiritual intuitions. So how do these line up? Well, the immediate and reflective is similar to the economic market period. The immediate non-reflective is similar to the short run. The immediate reflective is similar to the long run. And the eternal recursive, the spiritual intuitions, that's associated with the very long run. And so if we put this in a table, we get the following. So there are the time frames from very short to long to very long. The type is immediate or reflexive, immediate non-reflective, immediate reflective, and the eternal or recursive. And the realm and the cognitive resources. So the physical is the realm of instincts, and so your resources are fixed in a moment. It's however you're hardwired. The emotional, the resource has to deal with feelings, And some things are fixed. So maybe certain beliefs and reasons are treated as fixed. In the realm of the rational and reasons, even your beliefs and your reasons can be varied. But in the realm of the transcendent and intuitions or the spiritual, utility maximization, the utility function itself is variable. And so that's the realm where you're changing your priorities and goals and such. And that's why the very long run is different than the other runs, because now you're going to be making choices about how do you produce utility? How do you produce satisfaction? Right? How much satisfaction are you choosing to get from what you're doing? And associated with this is also in the very short run, the realm of the physical, the behavior is fixed, right? The only thing you can do is either change your focus of being aware of what you're doing or not what you're doing, but you can't change your behavior. As you get into the short, long, and very long, the behavior is variable. And in terms of decision making, in the long run, it's utility maximization. In the very short, utility maximization collapses to hedonic maximization, right? Because if you can't change your behavior, then about the only thing you can do is either choose to enjoy the experience or not. And the very long, now you're in the realm of the meta-rational, the recursively rational. So this is where you're choosing how to decide. All of this is very important because some of the criticisms of principles out of especially market economics were based on presumably rational long-run arguments. Take a look at in macroeconomics. There's a big difference between those who are building short-run models and long-run models. And very often in macroeconomics, the long-run models are basically saying, don't interfere with the market. It's just going to go back to its equilibrium. The only thing you're going to do is change overall price levels. If technology is changing very slowly, if population is changing slowly, right? If all those things are changing very, very slowly, there can be an argument to be made. But in a world where technology is changing very quickly, demographics are changing quickly, that is no longer true. Basically, the idea is that, yes, the market will tend to go to equilibrium, supply and demand. But if that equilibrium is also changing quickly, then it's not going to the equilibrium at the beginning of the process. It's going to end up aiming for the equilibrium at the end of the process, which means that the market may never actually be at equilibrium. It's always going toward equilibrium, but if the equilibrium is changing, market may never be in equilibrium. So let's consider some other perspectives about time and then see how this relates to time as a constraint in decision making. Time and spectrum. A spectrum is the entire range over which some measurable property of a physical system or phenomenon can vary, such as the frequency of sound or the wavelength of electromagnetic radiation. So a rainbow is an example of a spectrum of light. So frequencies and hence wavelengths are associated with time through the speed with which they propagate. Each cycle in a wave can also represent the time between an expression outward and its return as an impression. So we can talk about reflections and echoes. So the longer the time, the greater the length of cycles, the increased capacity to reason and think. This is why if you have more time before a deadline to make your choice or decision, you are in a position to have more reflections and hence to be more rational, sort of more cool-headed, right, and not be driven as much by emotions or just immediate instinct. And so we can represent this as follows graphically. So to the left is a past event, and to the right is a future event. So if you're between these two events, what do we see? When you're just after the previous event, you're still going to have an immediate or physical awareness. But you have a lot more time in terms of making a decision for the future event. So where your awareness may be at, only at the physical level, you're actually in a position to have an immediate, reflective, rational decision-making process. As we move along away from the past event and closer to the future event, well, then instead of it being the physical awareness, now we're getting into emotional awareness. But now we're also having the time pressure kick in, which means we may not be able to be as reflective. And so we're more likely to be driven by emotional decision making. And finally, as we get closer to the next event, well, now we have significantly more time with which to have immediate rational awareness of what happened. In other words, the more time we have from a past event, the more we could look back, reflect on it, and bring our rational resources to our awareness and consider what has happened. But now we're getting closer to the future event where it may turn into an immediate or physical decision-making process. We have this interesting flow where as we go between events, yes, we gain more rational insight about what may have happened in the past, but we lose our ability to make rational decisions because of the time pressure of something about to happen. How does this deal with waves and frequencies and such? Well, if we overlay the same number of cycles associated with the different length of time, what do we see? The immediate physical awareness is associated with a very high frequency. In other words, the number of cycles divided by a very short period of time, higher frequency. The same number of cycles, but a long period of time, that's a low frequency. And what we see is this process of looking back, going from being high frequency and forward-looking being low frequency to looking back being low frequency and making decision high frequency. Now, from an advanced set of ideas, there's the notion of a spectral density. So spectrums can be analyzed to find peaks that indicate properties of what is observed. So for example, in physics, finding absorption patterns of light indicates what elements an object is made of. Okay? And so in this image here is an example of the spectra, how much density, how much relative energy associated with different frequencies, associated with different types of light. And so here you see noon sunlight, that seems to have the broadest spectrum. White light has got a little bit more of a peak in the blue range. Look at the barcode scanning laser. That's a very, very narrow spectra, and it has to be, right? Because it's trying to be very specific in the information being communicated. We can put this out as a notion of, is there a spectral analysis of consciousness? If applied to consciousness, the meaning of such analysis would be what frequencies or wavelengths we're focusing on. For those who are familiar with EEGs, that's electroencephalogram, they record wave-like activity in the brain. And when we talk about the brain and its relationship to decision-making and choices, we will see that different frequencies are associated with different types of awareness, which would then also be associated with different types of decision-making. So higher frequencies tend to be more somatic and sensory, thus more immediate consciousness, and lower frequencies tend to be more reflective and meditative, thus less immediate consciousness. So in the context of decision making, what we focus on are the choices we make. This brings us to the next challenge, which is resource optimization over deciding and implementing the choices we make. So sometimes we use similar resources for both making decisions and implementing those choices. This is sometimes referred to as cognitive processing and executive control. So if you had $100 to spend between products and information about those products, how much would you spend on each? What if it was you had 100 hours to spend between deciding what to do and doing? Well, an important phrase that we run into in the business world certainly is paralysis by analysis. We can imagine a situation where you see a bear 100 yards away, it's moving in your direction. The door to your house is about 50 yards away. A strong pointy stick is about 10 yards away. How would you decide what to do? So by the time you've reflected on whether running to your home or going to pick up the stick was the better choice, the bear may already be on top of you, which is the worst outcome. So a reflexive or instinctive response, either way, would be preferred to fighting a bear empty-handed. In some cases, a faster decision provides a better outcome. So a faster decision, even if you don't end up picking the best, is still a lot better than not making a decision at all. This is one of the we're dealing with here, with time as a constraint. And also, this comes into play with behavioral economics, where sometimes it's not important that you pick the ideal solution. Sometimes it's just pick a solution and move on. Now, this brings up the issue of practicing choosing. Right? In other words, if you need to make quick decisions, that is something that you practice as well. Example, in sports or artistic performances and in security training, practicing allows one to develop hardwired instincts and habits so that you do not need to use reflective thought to make a choice. So many coaches will encourage their athletes to avoid overthinking. So the distinction between tactical skills and strategic thought can show up in misunderstandings between workers and executives. This is one of the challenges that we run into in the everyday. If you're an executive, if you're working at that high level strategic thinking, you may not be concerned with the most precise, optimal thing is done by an individual worker. What you're counting on is the job will get done in a satisfactory way such that your strategic image can be implemented. Whereas if you're the worker and you're told to do something by a certain time, you're going to be much more aware of, is that even feasible? One example is storing boxes. We went over this a little bit last time, so we'll go over this again. How an example with a numeric solution, how it does show up differently. You've rented a storage locker and you have 100 boxes to put away. The boxes are marked, providing information on which you might want to get sooner. You have a friend to help you, but they only have 2 hours and they're a little impatient. How much time do you spend deciding how to choose the boxes? How much time do you spend deciding how to store the boxes? In this particular case, TA is the time to act, TD is the time to decide, and the constraint is that TA plus TD is 120 minutes. If the preference structure is TA times TD to the beta, so beta represents how strong the priorities are, we'll consider two situations. Strong priorities, beta is equal to 2. Weak priorities, beta is equal to 0.25. What would beta equal if there were no priorities? Well, if there was no priorities, beta would be equal to 0. There's the graphical result we had seen previously. But if we do the calculations, what do we get? Well, if there are weak priorities, you would spend about 25 minutes deciding and 95 minutes storing. But if there are strong priorities about how useful the order of the storing of the boxes are, in that case, you might spend 80 minutes deciding and then 40 minutes storing. And in the case of no priorities, right, it doesn't make a difference. You'd spend 0 time deciding. You'd use whole 120 minutes to store boxes. So again, this is a reminder that, when we're talking about time as a constraint, we are making decisions about not only how to make decisions, but how much time we spend making decisions. Okay. And now another principle out of economics, opportunity cost, and trying to minimize opportunity cost. So let's consider another situation, another scenario. You start with 100 different flavors of ice cream. It takes you 6 seconds to read each flavor so you can see what the ingredients are. It takes you 1 minute to decide which to buy. For every minute you take deciding, one flavor is taken away. How long do you take to decide? What is the variable cost of deciding? What is the fixed cost? How do you deal with the risk of having a tasty flavor become unavailable while you are considering more alternatives? I'm not going to give you a specific answer here, but it is a reminder that if you want to consider every option that you have, and there are lots and lots of options, in the process of trying to consider all of them, some of these options go away. And this is part of what we mean by a very long run decisions, where what is even feasible can change. So whereas before the notion is technology can change and it's typically presented as technology will improve, it can actually go the other way. In other words, if you're considering the very long run, what happens if you have a backwardation of your technological capacities? It backslides. That can happen. Well, and in that kind of case, it's even more imperative that you do what you can do while you still have the feasibility to do something. If we have built our economy and our socioeconomic philosophies and perspectives on ever increasing technology and technological capacities, we will have one sense of what is an optimal thing to do now than if we're looking at the future and saying, well, you know what, we're not going to have the same capacity to produce in the future as we do now. Next, we want to look at time and uncertainty as a constraint. Now, how does time and uncertainty work together? Well, the further into the future we look, the more uncertain it tends to be. And people have a limited capacity to hold uncertainty in their mind. So one way we reduce such uncertainty is to weight issues as less important or even completely ignore them. Sometimes we do what is most expedient just to reduce the amount that is on our mind. And sometimes the most expedient solution leads to a situation that increases the amount on our mind. I'm sure everyone can relate to doing something that was expedient because you just wanted to handle something, only to find out that when the consequences came in, you actually ended up with a worse situation. So this brings us to the notion of a certainty principle. Right? So imagine a situation where instead of money limiting what you can choose, uncertainty is the cost. So associated with each good is uncertainty around how much it will benefit you. And at any moment, you can hold only a finite amount of uncertainty. And so mathematically, WT is the share of attention on moment T. This plays the role of quantity. Sigma T is going to be the uncertainty around moment T. This plays the role of price. And we can define sigma C as the capacity to process uncertainty. This plays the role of income. In such a case, the sum of WT times sigma T has to be less than or equal to sigma C. So you have a budget constraint in terms of how to be able to process uncertainty. So the certainty principle is that a decision maker weighs future events so that the sum of uncertainty over all events is bounded, and a weight of 0 is assigned to ignored events. These are equations to represent either discrete moments that you're thinking, or if it's a continuum of moments. And so the requirement for greater certainty is represented by decreasing sigma C. Right? So if you've got someone or some organization that needs more certainty in order to make its decisions, it's going to have a more limiting constraint because sigma c will be smaller. Let's define n as equal to sigma c divided by sigma 0. So sigma 0 is the uncertainty about what's going on right now. And sigma c is our total capacity to deal with uncertainty. So n is the capacity to process uncertainty in units of uncertainty of the current period. So if uncertainty about future events grows exponentially with distance into the future, we can have that represented as the uncertainty at time t is equal to the uncertainty in the present, so sigma 0, times the exponential raised to the power of nu t. So nu then represents how quickly the future becomes uncertain. Nu is just a parameter. What's important here is that as t increases, so the further you go into the future, the more uncertain. So the larger the capital N, the greater the potential to regard the future. The larger the nu, the V-looking letter, the less the potential to regard the future. So the certainty principle impacts which run will guide our decision making. Increasing uncertainty triggers us to move from long run to short run thinking, or from short run to immediate run thinking. As there's more and more uncertainty, we need to start ignoring more. That means we're going to ignore not just the far future, but maybe the intermediate future to the near future. So the greater amount of uncertainty, the more we just focus on what is happening right now. This then translates into moving from reasons to emotional thinking, or from emotional thinking to physical. The greater the uncertainty, the greater the carry cost to delay a decision, the more likely we will abandon reason for emotional or physical expression. So this is definitely something out of behavioral economics, where greater uncertainty and time pressure associates with individuals moving away from reflective, rational decision making to more emotional or just hardwired decisions. So that has implications for understanding some of the experimental frameworks when we're looking at people's behavior. And it also says something about how time pressure impacts people's sense of priorities. If you're trying to figure out, well, what do you really want? And you tell someone, well, make a decision like that. The priority is not picking the best decision. The priority is making a decision quickly. And making the decision quickly is maybe indicative of how you're hardwired. Maybe it'll express where you are emotionally, but it doesn't necessarily represent what you would choose or decide to choose if you could reflect on the consequences. Okay, so what is the implications of all this? Well, the less space we have to consider and process future alternatives, the nearer we start ignoring the consequences of our actions, and the more myopic are our decisions. So the greater pressures we have, there's more uncertainty, the nearer the time horizon, the more we tend to be myopic, and the more myopic we're being, the more we move away from rational decision making to just emotional or hardwired responses. Okay, so our next step is to consider what this space is and how to make the most of it. Now, one closing bonus thought, the notion of concentric eternities. So we can imagine the universe as the whole space from which we draw our experiences. So a perspective that steps outside of a timeline is eternal. That's what it is to be an eternity, is you are not in the mundane temporal world. You have stepped outside of that. So if you're outside of a particular timeline, there can be more than one eternal perspective, but they all have the same center, right? So it's all a common universe with all these, potential experiences to draw from. But just because you're coming from an eternal perspective doesn't mean there's only one eternal perspective. Hence, there can be concentric eternities. What does this mean? If there are concentric eternities, we can think of concentric economies. Next time, we'll take a look at the brain as the space within which we make decisions.